Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. You join me at my kitchen table today for something a little bit different. As many of you may know, I have recently acquired Rangers of Shadow Deep, and in getting ready to play that game, it suddenly became apparent to me that while I have a lot of tabletop terrain, I'm quite lacking in generic terrain like trees. So I had to look into sourcing some trees, and my initial thought was that I would make some trees. So I looked around on YouTube for videos on how to make trees, and I found a few that said here's a really quick, effective, cheap way to do it. And the processes involved looked quite time consuming, and most of them involved purchasing some tree armatures, which are plastic frames, and then building up your trees from those. And I looked into the price of just the armatures, and they were about £15 a bag, and that was before I purchased any of the other items that I would need. And I wanted something that was going to be a little bit cheaper than that. So I headed to Amazon to check out some pre-assembled, ready-to-use trees. And I found a few options, and I found one that was a set of 22 trees for £10. The trees were in varying sizes, and some of the sizes were going to be of little use to me. Let me set this aside for a moment. I will show you what I mean. The largest trees in the set were about 6.5 inches, which is a good size. That's pretty big. But it also said that some of the trees in the set would be just over an inch. And those really aren't a lot of use. And it didn't say in the listing how many of each you were going to get. But I figured 22 trees for £10, say I can use half of those trees. That works out at £1 each. There was no way I was going to be able to make them for that price. So I took a punt. And as it turned out, there were about 14 trees all told that I could use. They were all of vastly different sizes, but there was about 14 that were tall enough to be good for tabletop terrain. And to be honest, the little ones that you get, they do have their uses as well. I mean, off the top of my head, I think if you were going to be making some hobbit holes or something, you could stick little trees like this into planters out the front to look like a homely little hobbit had been growing some trees on his patio or something like that. If you wanted a manor house which had a nice garden, you could probably make use of these, or you could probably squash a few of them together to look like a hedgerow. There is certainly uses for those regardless, but not for this particular project. It is the taller ones that were of interest to me. So I had 13 or 14 trees, which look pretty decent. They have a sort of rubberized finish. They do shed their flock a little bit, but not too much. The trunks are brown. You could paint them, you could texture them up if you wanted to, but I think they look fine as is. And anybody who follows my channel will know that I am always looking for the quickest and most effective ways to get things on the tabletop that look decent without having to really invest a lot of time and money into having things that look absolutely immaculate. But the one thing I did need was I needed bases for these trees. So as you can see, this is what I have come up with. This is a scenic base using a few simple things that I had around the house. And the trees themselves, I've got 3 trees on this particular base. And at the moment, they're not actually glued in. They are removable, and this is down to a choice thing. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to glue them or not. Not gluing them has its benefits. There's a few benefits. First of all, it makes it easier to store. You can pluck the trees out, keep the bases flat, keep the trees separate. It just takes a little bit longer to set them up before a game. The other thing is if you have large units moving into your woodland area, obviously you would use the base itself to define the edges of the wood, even though there's only 3 trees there. So, if something is here and something is here, even if they could see between those trees, you would abstract it out a little bit that the trees are blocking because it is a woodland. But if something moves into that woodland area, if you have a large unit moving in there and you have trees you can remove, you can just pop the trees out to make space for your units whilst they're in that area, and then when they're out you can stick them back in again. But like I say, I haven't decided yet. I may glue them in just because I don't know how wobbly the trees will get in there over time. But anyway, just to show you for scale, here's a recently painted Draugr. You will find a video on how I painted this guy on the channel. But you can see the trees, they're not massive. They're not really true scale to your miniatures. This is a 32mm miniature, by the way. But I think it's going to get the job done, and for very little cost, really. So what the rest of this video is going to be a very quick step-by-step on how I actually made the bases to go with these pre-purchased trees, which hopefully some people will find useful. To start, I've got a polystyrene ceiling tile. These used to be something that people quite often stuck on their ceilings back in the day, but you don't really see it much in houses anymore. But I think I picked up a pack of 20 of these in a hardware store for maybe £1, maybe £2. It was next to nothing. And these are really good for this sort of thing. They're easy to cut. They already have a little bit of texture on them, which can be helpful. And that's what we're going to be using to form the base for our trees. So as you can see, I've just got a craft knife. I'm just going to cut it down to the size that I want. Being polystyrene, it does bobble a little bit, but you get relatively clean cuts with this. And it's just really lightweight and easy to use. I've had these tiles for a long time because I don't do a lot of craft projects like this. I'm sure they're still readily available. As you can see, having cut it to the size that I want, I am now going to shape it into something other than a rectangle. So I've angled my knife and I'm just creating an embankment. And I'm kind of letting the knife go where it wants to go. I'm creating a curved shape. Obviously cutting away from myself so I don't slip and lose a finger. It's never worth losing a finger for your hobby. So I'm just going all the way around, and I'm not even worrying about maintaining a consistent angle on the blade. It just needs to make sure that you do have a slope all the way around. It's just going to make it look a little better on the tabletop than having a straight edge. Having cut all the way around, we have our basic shape for our base, and I'm going to be using this for a group of 3 trees. So I've picked a sort of mid-size sort of base. And now, just to improve the rigidity of the base, we're going to mount it onto a piece of thin corrugated card. This is a packaging from Amazon. So I'm just going to use some PVA glue, just regular PVA. I'm just going to slop loads of it on the bottom of the polystyrene, and then I will mount it onto the card, put it under a weight just to ensure we get a good strong bond on it. I'm using a big old brush for this. Do not use your best Games Workshop brushes for PVA glue. It's not good for them. So this will be squashed under a weight until it is dry, just so we've got a good bond. And this will just help with the strength of the piece. Polystyrene is obviously very flaky and very brittle. Putting it on a piece of card or even a thin piece of wood obviously improves the strength of it. And once that glue is dry, we just need to cut around the shape again. So I am back with my trusty craft knife, and I'm just going to cut as close as possible around the polystyrene without actually cutting any of the polystyrene. Once we've gone all the way around, we can pop that out. And at this point, you should really figure out where you're going to put your trees and stab the trees into the polystyrene to make little holes to indicate where those trees are going to go. But I kind of forgot to do that first, so I will do that in a moment after I have coated the whole thing in another layer of PVA glue. And this layer of PVA glue is just, again, to strengthen it up and to seal the edges. The polystyrene being flaky, bits are going to flake off of it. And then once that PVA is on, you're just going to leave it to dry again completely. But here in the video, what I'm going to do is try and stick the trees in. The reason that you should do the trees before you paint the PVA is because the PVA makes the polystyrene a little bit squishy, so when you push the trees in, you don't get a crisp punch where the tree goes in and creates a perfect size hole for it. It actually squashes the polystyrene more, so you get a looser fit, which can be a problem later on if you're going to leave the trees not glued in. So yeah, punch your trees in first, then paint it with the coat of PVA glue. Next up, I'm going to paint this base, and I'm going to use the textured paint Sterling Mud, and that's just to provide some extra texture to the base. You can use a regular paint which isn't textured. Because the tile itself has a rough texture anyway, you are going to get a little bit of texture there anyway, even if you use a normal paint. But using the textured Sterling Mud paint just gives it even more texture, and it's going to create additional surface area for when we flock the base in a moment. It will improve the chances of the flock adhering to the base because there's more surface area to be in contact with the flock. And of course, the reason we're painting it brown is because when we flock over the top with a green flock, there will always be little bits that show through, and you don't want white showing through that flock. You want brown to show through so it looks like dirt under the grass. You don't need to be too picky about this, but you don't need to worry about 2 coats or anything like that. You just want 1 good coat over the whole thing. You just don't want any of that white to be showing through. When it's done, we are back to our PVA glue again, and we are going to paint PVA glue all over our brown base. Again, using an old rubbish brush, but it's a good idea to use a big wide brush just to speed up the whole process. And you want a good thick coat of glue over the whole thing. And when it's all done, it's time to apply the flock. And you just want to sprinkle this over the whole thing. You want to heap it on. Any excess you can shake off and reuse later anyway, but you want to make sure the whole thing is covered. You may also want to put a straw or a cocktail stick or something in each of the holes where you're going to be putting the trees, because if your flock dries all over the whole base, you may have trouble locating those holes later on. So if you just put something in there, just so you can find them again easily. But the main aim here is to make sure that your flock is completely covering the whole base. When the glue is completely dry, you can shake all the excess off of the base. Make sure you catch all that excess so you can put it back in the bag and reuse it, especially if you're doing a lot of bases. You want to make sure that you're not wasting anything or running out halfway through the job. And when you're done, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. And you could leave it at that really, but I'm going to do a few extra details. I've got a little bag of rubble here, and we're going to scatter just a little bit of this over the base, just in little areas, just to add a little bit of texture, a little bit more interest, something that makes it look a little bit more realistic. So I've got a little bit of PVA glue in a pot, and I'm using tweezers just to grab the stones, roll them around in the glue, and then just pop them onto the base. And once you've put on all the stones you want to do, and there's no reason or rhyme to how you do that, just so it looks good, you need to finally give your whole base a misting of a sealer. I am using some scenic cement that I have here, which is basically like really runny PVA, and you put it into a spray bottle. You shake it up really well, you put it in a spray bottle, and you just spray the whole thing, and that will just seal the whole thing in so that you have a nice finished product which is not going to shed all its bits everywhere. And then you put the trees in, you glue them in if you want to glue them in, or you don't, and there you have it. That's your finished thing. And you can see that I've made a whole bunch of these with my trees that I got off of Amazon, and I'm pretty happy with how those have turned out. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you liked it, please consider pressing the like button. If you really liked it, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I will see you all again very soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.